Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitics survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast-changing world of high-tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Rakshith, a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, and in this episode we are focusing on the recently concluded COP29 climate summit held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Joining us today is a very special guest, Anika Patel from Carbon Brief, who's a China analyst and a climate policy expert. She also holds a Master of Law in International Relations from Peking University in China. Welcome to the show, Anika. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rakshith.
Before we jump right in, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the amazing work that Carbon Brief does, can you please tell us a little bit about the organization and the type of work that you specifically do in China Desk?
Of course, and thank you. That's very kind. So Carbon Brief is a news organization that focuses specifically on everything and anything to do with climate change, looking both at the science behind what's driving global warming and the policy reactions of various countries and international institutions. We have a number of excellent journalists looking at everything from COP29 to plastic treaty negotiations. And that also includes the work of me and my colleagues at the China Desk. We have a series of newsletters from daily news roundups covering what the Western and global media are saying about climate change to specific newsletters focused on China's energy transition and climate transition, as well as biodiversity, food, land, and nature.
That's amazing. Anika, so my first question, I really want to understand the basics of it. Firstly, I want to talk about the host of the conference itself, Azerbaijan, who was a controversial choice to host the entire conference, right? Being the third petrostate in a row to do so, Egypt and Dubai being the previous two. What were the immediate reactions to its selection, and did these concerns basically play out during the entire summit? I'm asking you this because beyond fossil fuels, there was a criticism of Azerbaijan's handling of the entire negotiation process, right? Some labeled it deplorable, and the French climate minister even boycotted the second week of talks. Can you tell us more about these issues and how they may have impacted the outcome of the entire conference?
Absolutely. I think controversial is definitely the correct word for it. It really depends who you ask, right? Some people will say what makes the COP process and the UNFCCC structure unique and interesting and effective is that you're bringing in a wide variety of states, many of whom have different interests and different outlooks on the urgency of the climate crisis and the climate transition. And you're really trying to forge unity and long-lasting consensus and long-lasting direction, right? So if you speak to those people, involving petrostates like Azerbaijan is a crucial part of the process, because otherwise you're just talking in an echo chamber, and a lot of states, even if they might say nice things about the energy transition, they aren't necessarily bought into the process. But as you said, from the other side, there are questions and concerns with Azerbaijan, as there were in Dubai and in Egypt, about how having a petrostate as the president specifically might limit the impactfulness of that particular COP. So at COP29, there were allegations from the outset that the organizers were using the COP platform to make oil and gas deals. The Azerbaijani president, Ilham Aliyev, said during these the world leaders summit, where world leaders from each country will really kind of lay out in a very authoritative way how their country will be approaching negotiations that year. He said that oil and gas was a gift from God, right? So a very strong signal about how Azerbaijan might approach the COP. And these kind of early signals really lingered, I think, throughout the COP, and there was a lot of concern. And yeah, that kind of snowballed, if you will, throughout the summit. So not only were there concerns because Azerbaijan is a petrostate and there were, concerns around this lack of ambition, but also there were maybe concerns the presidency hadn't prepared as well as negotiators would like. So, as you mentioned, there were these big kind of geopolitical moves with Argentina and France pulling out of the summit. And that was really over things that weren't to do with the climate transition themselves, but that really cast a dampener on sentiment and on, the effectiveness of specifically the EU in being able to position itself as a climate leader. But then on top of that, there was just a lot of confusion around the specific role that the presidency played in trying to, facilitate this agreement, which, as I mentioned, is really, it's a tall order because you need to have consensus from all of the negotiators, all of the participating member states to get, this kind of final agreement out of the COP. And going into negotiations, we had cover texts that were full of conditional language and full of these kind of items that hadn't even had the foundation for an agreement agreed. There were what we call bracketed text, which basically means, a text will be kind of proposed by the presidency and by kind of lead negotiators, but it'll include areas that are bracketed that are kind of the bracket signal. This is open to debate. It's open to negotiation. We don't have a complete agreement from all of the parties. You will have a lot of those brackets in the text at the beginning of any COP, but particularly in Azerbaijan, people were shocked by the lack of preparation with the text and just how many of these brackets featured in a lot of the key kind of documents. On top of that, a lot of parties were pushing for things like a cover text, which is basically like your executive summary. So you have a lot of these very long technical documents, and it is expected, so for example, with Dubai, that there would be a cover text giving, the headline agreements and these kind of core messages where the president can say, all countries have agreed to X, Y, and Z. And Azerbaijan at the beginning was very clear that there wouldn't be a cover text, which again kind of led to a lot of concern over the fact that, maybe there's a lack of ambition and maybe a step back from COP28. And then on top of that, negotiating leads. So again, these kind of countries that are picked out to really try and hammer home an agreement and kind of negotiate between all of the different parties and lead the process. There are reports from a lot of these negotiators that there was confusion around what their exact roles were supposed to be, what the presidency in Azerbaijan expected from them. Timelines seem to be very, very short and unrealistic in some people's words. And then to top it all off, right at the end of the COP, there was also controversy over the edit access that was allowed to Saudi Arabia, which is another petrostate that is notorious for trying to limit the ambition of COPs. And it was revealed that a Saudi Arabian negotiator had been given edit access to a document that only the presidency should be able to edit and change, and that specific countries should only be able to suggest changes to. And so that really undermined a lot of confidence and a lot of goodwill, I think, towards the Azerbaijani presidency. Having said all that, we did come to a decision, right? There was agreements and agreed text gavelled through on a number of key issues. But I think that there were concerns at the beginning that an already tough COP was being made harder by a lack of preparation and a lack of transparency. And I think that maybe those views were vindicated.
Hmm. That's really amazing. I mean, Anika, to be honest, a lot of us, at least in India here, didn't have much expectations from the COP29, given the amount of revenue oil and gas produces for the host country, Azerbaijan. But those were like really great insights. I want to focus on and move to climate finance, because this entire conference was dubbed as the finance COP, right? Due to its focus on setting on a new climate finance goal. But before that, can you also walk us around the 100 billion climate finance pledge that was made back in 2009, which was meant to be delivered by 2020 but got delayed by 2 years? And with this context in mind, can you also explain what the new collective quantified goal, which is NCQG, is? And ultimately, I know, I mean, developed countries agreed to give only $300 billion a year, if I'm not wrong, and this climate finance to developing countries by 2035. What were the expectations from the developing countries? I mean, what was that amount and how did it fare, and how was this final figure received? Do you think it's enough?
Sure. So as you mentioned, there already has been agreements made in previous COPs around climate finance. So in Copenhagen in 2009, it was agreed that developed countries, which is a very specific technical category, there's a list of who these developed countries are in Annex 1 of the UNFCCC. And they were supposed to provide $100 billion per year to developing countries by now, as you said. But the controversy was that, as with many things to do with finance and stumping up money, there were delays. The 100 billion was never reached. And the Paris Agreement had specified that by this year, the 100 billion agreement would expire and needed to be replaced by a new agreement that used 100 billion as the floor, right? So that means that from this COP, there needed to be an agreement that countries would provide more than 100 billion a year, provide and mobilize as well, which is, again, very kind of technical jargon that means that basically countries either need to provide it themselves through public finance, ideally through grant-based finance and not loans, but also mobilize, which means that they need to encourage multilateral development banks or private institutions under their jurisdiction to also be providing this climate finance. So that was, as you mentioned, the heart of discussions at this COP, the climate finance COP. Again, kind of speaking to what I was just explaining about the lack of preparation, countries were expecting to see some indication of a figure when the COP opened this year. That didn't happen. So in the climate finance negotiation text, there was no mention of any figure, and that kind of paved the way for 2 weeks of very intense negotiations, perhaps more intense than they might have been if countries had like a figure to start from. So you had a lot of developing countries, as you mentioned, kind of pushing for this figure of $1.3 trillion per year. Again, this is provided by countries in terms of public finance, but also mobilized around private finance. And it was based on research by academics, Lord Stern, Vera Songwe, Bhattacharya, and others who really kind of put in who used models to kind of come to this figure. It wasn't just plucked out of the air. And so that was the number that developing countries were pushing for. At the end of the first week, beginning of the second week, there started to be indications that the number that developed countries would put together was around 100 billion, a couple of 100 billion. And I remember this was put to a couple of lead negotiators for the LDC and for a couple of the developing country negotiation blocks, and they laughed. They assumed it was a joke, which kind of indicates how I think a lot of developing country negotiators felt at the time. And this eventually got nudged up in the last few hours of negotiations to 300 billion. But again, that's both public and private finance. It doesn't include loss and damage, which for any of your listeners who aren't aware, is a big decision that was made at COP28 for the establishment of a fund specifically for climate vulnerable countries who saw extreme weather, extreme drought or flooding or typhoons, whatever it might be, that damaged infrastructure, that damaged homes. There was supposed to be a fund or some sort of finance that would make up for those climate impacts. That was not covered under the NCQG. And as a result, the 300 billion was approved after, as I mentioned, this very intense negotiations. But you saw, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners saw this in the news, you saw a lot of countries, including India, Nigeria, and Bolivia, were very unhappy with the fact that this 300 billion was finalized. India made a formal kind of protest at the closing ceremony, although it didn't stop the 300 billion from being decided. But I think we're going to see a lot of that kind of negative energy carries through to the next COP. And it'll be really interesting to see how Brazil takes the kind of finance discussion forward. And then also the other element of this was that this kind of controversy around the expansion of the donor base. So as I mentioned, climate finance has traditionally been from a very specific list of developed countries to developing countries. Developed countries in particular wanted to see that donor base expanded to include countries like India, China, and Gulf states, countries that, are traditionally seen as developing countries. But I think one of the specific examples that came out of donor country negotiators was countries that might have space programs and might have money to spend on what might be seen as kind of advanced technologies and advanced research. Should they also be expected to contribute? And I think another argument from specifically, or rather especially from donor countries, was that, we're going through periods of economic crisis. Politically, we're the Western countries are very troubled by, rising right-wing sentiments. If centrist or more left-wing governments are seen to be handing out what would be interpreted as development aid or aid to countries that, have a lot of economic strength, then does that cause long-term issues for them domestically? On the other hand, developing countries would argue or did argue, and I should say as well, developing countries is a useful catch-all, but it is a little bit of a generalization. There are a lot of different voices within the developing country bloc. But just as a shorthand, developing countries might push back and say, well, the 100 billion, as we mentioned earlier, wasn't provided by developed countries until very, very close to the deadline. There's a track record of, climate finance being promised, but not actually being mobilized and being delivered. So for them, or at least for some of them, expanding the donor base was seen as a way for developed countries to try and dilute their own responsibility and kind of take pressure off them and maybe, kick the can down the road. So it was very contentious. As I mentioned, the 300 billion was achieved, but there's a lot of controversy going into COP30 in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. And within the, climate finance domain, Carbon Reef has done a brilliant analysis on the flows of climate finance through different institutions, right? And somewhere I read that most of the climate finance is given as a form of loan to these developing countries, which again was not the whole purpose of coming up with the idea. And also, there has been various instances where these money were diverted from other bilateral aid development programs, right? The whole point of climate finance was that it was supposed to be new and additional, which means that you cannot divert these funds from other aid and development programs to climate finance. So that was the second depressing stuff to read. And also, finally, that a lot of countries have financed projects which do not have to do anything with climate change and still labeled it as climate finance. So I think the standards for accounting and the transparency system within the entire climate finance ecosystem is really poor, and we need to work on this too. But yeah, that being said, I think you gave a brilliant primer on the entire topic of the climate finance. But I really want to talk about the US elections and how Trump's going to react to the entire Inflation Reduction Act and the geopolitics of climate change, right? We know that he has previously withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. How do you see his administration dealing with Biden's single largest investment in climate and green energy in American history, that is Inflation Reduction Act? He already labeled it as a green scam, right? And do you see a drastic shift in the way the USA will look at climate change, or is the institutional structure in the US and globally robust enough to survive another Trump presidency?
Absolutely. I mean, the entire hallmark of the first Trump administration was volatility and uncertainty, right? And I think that that's going to carry through to the second administration. I have to preface this entire conversation with a question mark, right? We don't know how Trump's thinking or how the nuances of Trump's approach might change, how the people around him might change, and as a result, how the information that he's getting might change. But based on what we know now, we know that he's very pro-oil, very drill, baby drill, right? Anti-environment,
Right.
and that he said that he wants to dismantle the IRA. And I think that, these are hallmarks that might not change. At the same time, you have people around him, even such unexpected sources as like the head of ExxonMobil telling him not to move out of the Paris Agreement. Elon Musk, for now, is probably in his favor, we think. And again, this is a guy who, in theory, understands that there is a climate crisis. So there are voices that might shift the needle. But as we know right now, he has said that he wants to dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act, and that he does want to pull out of the Paris Agreement. So again, that's the massive caveat that we think we know what he wants to do, but things might change. In practice, I'll take the IRA first. The IRA, actually, the way that it's built was very clever. And as a result, it might be harder to dismantle than Trump currently realizes. It was specifically designed to benefit a lot of Republican states and to send money for investment, for jobs, to states that traditionally might have had a problem with, the woke Democrat climate agenda. And as a result, even if Trump does try to, I think that Trump would find it very hard to unilaterally get rid of the IRA because he'll have pushback from so many of his supporters who need that money to rejuvenate their local economies. So then the question becomes, how is he going? What areas can he really kind of tinker with? And I think that's what it'll be. It'll be tinkering around the edges, getting rid of maybe minor programs that, he can shout about how he's, reversing Biden's woke agenda. But the actual core of the finance and the actual benefits for the US clean tech supply chains probably will stay in place. In terms of climate diplomacy and the Paris Agreement, it's a lot more serious. Last time, he didn't realize that getting out of the Paris Agreement is actually quite a long process, and he left it very late. So he managed to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement, but then that happened too close to the end of his first term. Biden came back in and put the US right back in, right? This time, he's a little bit savvier. He'll probably put that top of his agenda. And so we are very likely to see a diminished US role at that kind of national level in international climate diplomacy. But on the flip side of that, what US negotiators were very keen to kind of highlight when they were in Azerbaijan was that you still have subnational climate action. So you have state level leaders like Californian Governor Gavin Newsom, who's very much put himself out there as kind of the leader of subnational US climate action, working with his counterparts and possibly even with national level leaders from other countries. So obviously with my focus on China, something that's interest to us is that Gavin Newsom has met Xi Jinping and is working with national level Chinese leaders on kind of driving US-China climate diplomacy forward. He now has not a bigger mandate, but a much bigger opportunity to really set the tone in that space. And you also have think tanks, NGOs, private actors, companies. So when you're at COPs, it's obviously the kind of biggest news is what the national level negotiators are doing. But you also have this constellation of private sector and think tank representatives sharing knowledge, making connections. And I think for the US, that's going to be where we see the most movement in the next 4 years. With my US-China hat on, that's definitely where we'll be seeing the most bilateral cooperation there. I expect very minimal national government-to-government level cooperation over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And do you think China is an actor which will try to replace, at least in this domain, globally? I mean, in terms of representation, you work on China, right? And I know I should have made this podcast specifically on China and how did it behave at COP29, but also I wanted to give a rough background and primer for our audience about COP, the US stance, and everything. So that's why I kept the China section at the very last of our conversation. And we know that China faced increasing pressure to contribute to climate finance. You also mentioned that a lot of developing countries faced, like China and India. I mean, how did China respond to these pressures and calls? And did they signal any willingness to move beyond South-South cooperation? And it will be great if you could also explain to our listeners what this South-South cooperation means and how China has been using this framework to support other developing countries. Because somewhere I know I've read that in COP29, China used the language of climate finance to talk about its overseas aid. And they quoted some numbers and everything. But yeah, what's your take on how China was at COP29?
That's a great question. So China was at the center of several key debates at COP this year. Finance is kind of the topic, right? So it sucked up a lot of the attention from media and from negotiators, but also several other COP processes chugging along in the background also threw China's position and China's responsibilities into debate. So the country finds itself in quite a difficult position. It's simultaneously a developing country. There's a lot of income inequality. Negotiators would argue that, there's a lot that needs to be done domestically in terms of its own development, in terms of lifting up poorer areas of the country. Whereas developed countries, richer countries would argue that, look, not only is China one of the biggest emitters, it's currently the largest annual emitter, and some recent carbon brief analysis also found that it's overtaken the EU as of this year in terms of historical carbon emissions. It has, as we were talking about earlier, it has a space program. It has the world's second largest economy. It pumps a lot of money into science and technology, and is really leading in a lot of technological spaces, clean technologies, clean energy technologies being one of them. So you have a lot of pressure on China to increase its climate finance. What's really interesting, and is something that Carbon Brief has been tracking and writing about for a long time, is that China already provides a lot of climate finance. So your listeners might be very familiar with a lot of clean energy projects that China is financing along the Belt and Road, right? In kind of partner countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And these are often, but not always, policy bank concessional loans. It also makes commitments through MDBs, multilateral development banks. And a lot of different organizations over the years have really been trying to put numbers onto what China is contributing. So the country's executive vice premier, one of the 7 most powerful politicians in China, Ding Xuexiang, represented China at the World Leaders Summit this year. And he mentioned that China has provided around 24.5 billion in climate finance. And specifically, he said provided and mobilized. The first thing to note is that this may be a kind of lowball conservative figure compared to some of these analyses, independent analyses that I mentioned earlier. Some think tanks actually put the figure a lot higher than this number, but this is the number that China has publicly announced, 24.5 billion. And some of this, but honestly not all of it, was through what you mentioned, the South-South Cooperation Fund, which is in itself actually a really interesting project. So that was basically a political signal between President Xi Jinping in 2015 and President Barack Obama, where you had this bilateral meeting that had, not all of it, but a significant amount of it was focused on climate and how the US and China could push kind of climate cooperation and climate alignment forward. And what you had in terms of climate finance was this announcement from China of a South-South Cooperation Fund of $3.1 billion, which was announced simultaneously with the US, who put forward their own $3 billion of climate finance for developing countries. And so what it was meant to be was this kind of signal back in 2015 of, look, you have China and the US both committing to climate finance, but differentiated, so that the US kind of had this developed country status, and China wasn't joining the US or wasn't contributing to a US initiative, but instead was in lockstep with the US, providing finance to other developing countries. So it's this very kind of political dance showing just enough kind of climate cooperation between these two big emitters that then would send signals to the rest of the world. It's important to note a friend of Carbon Brief, Byford Tang, who until recently was at a UK think tank called E3G, has actually done a lot of very good work into it. I'd encourage anyone who's interested to actually to follow his body of work. So in this specific fund, China hasn't actually mobilized it hasn't mobilized that 3.1 billion. I think only maybe 10% or so of money under that specific finance stream was ever kind of implemented. But what we have seen instead is a lot of BRI funding for clean energy. And I think Executive Vice Premier Ding didn't explain exactly how that 24.5 billion figure was calculated. But I think the vast majority of that money comes through Belt and Road Initiative funding. So that might be, for example, the Garissa solar power plant in Kenya, or various kind of grid reform updates in Latin America. There's a lot of these kind of different clean energy projects happening through the BRI mechanism, funded by China's policy banks, but kind of operated by host countries. And that is probably kind of what made up a lot of that figure announced by Ding. So that's finance. And what we saw was kind of this, to go back to the phrase that I mentioned about provided and mobilized, what we saw is something very similar to that 2015 US-China announcement, where Ding kind of used UN vocabulary through these kind of provided and mobilized terms to say, look, China is doing this South-South cooperation finance provision. We are kind of playing a part, and it's something that is synonymous with climate finance, but again, kind of differentiating themselves so that China doesn't get drawn into being seen as a donor country, and so that it can keep its developing country status. A final note on finance before maybe I move into China's positions on other topics is there was a really interesting opinion article by the COP29 president, Mukhtar Babayev, where he said that China was willing to provide more climate finance and kind of contribute to some sort of 300 billion or some sort of climate figure. But the low number suggested by donor countries ended up, it would only have done that if kind of donor countries had scaled up their own ambition. And ultimately that didn't happen, right? We got 300 billion. And so according to Babayev, that kind of scuppered any room for China to play a larger role and to make a significant contribution, whether that would be quietly included in some sort of headline X 100 billion figure, or whether that would have been China making a separate announcement. We'll never know. Obviously, we have to be a bit careful with our sources. We might not necessarily want to take that at face value, but it is a really interesting kind of tidbit of information. And then kind of moving beyond finance, one other area that Wang Yuan and I at our China desk were looking at was signals around climate pledges for next year. So another big conversation that was going on at COP was preparation for the nationally determined contribution climate pledges, which again is kind of a very COP jargony word, but basically is talking about the climate pledges that countries obligated to update every 5 years, and the next deadline is 2025. So it's something that countries are expected to submit ahead of the next COP. Whether they do or not is a separate question, but there are a lot of conversations going around where, different countries are kind of trying to influence each other over the level of ambition in those climate pledges. So we were talking to a lot of people about what China was saying publicly and privately about what might be in their own climate pledges. Carbon Brief has a series of analyses that we do with KREA, which is a Finnish think tank, looking at China's quarterly carbon emissions. And KREA is of the view, and a lot of other institutions are kind of slowly picking up this view as well, that China might be peaking its carbon emissions either this year or next year, and that we might suddenly see China kind of go from its stage of carbon peaking into moving towards net zero emissions. And so this year is really seen as a key year to try and influence the rapidity with which China moves, kind of enters this next stage and tries to reduce its emissions. Publicly and in negotiations, we saw a lot of conservatism from Chinese negotiators. So in kind of nitty gritty arguments, China was saying, we don't want to align necessarily, see some sort of global alignment or guidance on what should be in our climate pledges. We should be allowed to determine the pledge ourselves. We don't want to be seen to be being pushed into, a particular figure or onto a particular path. And I should say that China isn't necessarily the only country that makes these arguments. So, yeah, it's not necessarily that China is the only one kind of holding back these kind of NDC global alignments, but that was seen as a negative signal by people who might want China to kind of scale up its climate ambition. So that was another key area. But then kind of hovering over the whole thing, as we were kind of talking about earlier, is, what is China's role going to be in COPs going forward, especially over the next 4 years when we kind of expect the US to play a very diminished role. So you have a lot of voices, including the executive secretary of the UNFCCC, so kind of the organizing body of all of the COPs. You had him saying that China has to step up leadership. You have people like the South African environment minister saying that they hope that China plays a bigger role. And I would say that China itself was, again, quite cautious in how it responded. So the head of the Chinese delegation, Vice Environment Minister Zhao Yingmin, was saying, China already does a lot, and maybe it could do a little bit more in future. I think in a separate interview with Chinese media, he said that China is the backbone of global climate action. Now that, in response to a question about the US's diminished role, but really that's kind of the strongest official messaging that I heard. The other question is if, with the US taking a step back, is there more room for China-EU alignment and the G2 becoming China and the EU really driving climate ambition forward? I think it's definitely possible. There are very strong existing bilateral climate frameworks for China and the EU. China and Germany in particular have a very strong track record on climate cooperation, and there's a lot of dialogues and kind of knowledge sharing between China and the EU on climate action. But at the same time, you have these very high profile disagreements over electric vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty in the EU's domestic political direction. So that could hamper prospects for a really strong EU-China alignment. We just have to wait and see. And the Chinese climate envoy himself was saying, that China would, I need to remember the exact wording, something around, it would be great if China and the EU could have this kind of alignment, but that they needed to acknowledge that there were significant problems that would need to be worked through first.
Right. I had a few more questions, Vanyan, but we are running short on time. And if I extend this podcast, my editor will definitely kill me. So I'll cut it short to China-specific questions. And I'd love to invite you again to specifically talk about various stuff that China is doing in this domain. So that'd be cool to explore because since you work on this and you'll have great insights on this. So that being said, I always do at the end of my podcast where I ask my guest, what is the one source apart from the organization that you work for, that you think is producing really great things? I mean, it can be an organization, or it can be a book or a resource that you really feel that is great for folks who are following this domain. So is there something that you want to share with our listeners?
Thank you. There's too many to choose from. I have a flood of newsletters in my inbox every morning. I'm a big newsletter subscriber, and I would say that for people interested in China and climate, one that you have to read is the Trivium China Net Zero newsletter. So I'd strongly encourage everyone to sign up to that. I think whilst Carbon Brief's newsletters are very high level and look a lot more at kind of big macro policy and climate diplomacy, the guys at Trivium are very good at getting into like very nitty gritty details about specific regulations or about industry trends and movements that I personally find really helpful to my own work.
That's so cool. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Anika. And thank you so much for your insights. And thank you, listeners, for staying with us, listening to this episode. And Anika, it's been a really pleasure having you on this show today. Thank you so much for making time and sharing your insights. Thanks again.
Thank you, Rakshith. It's been great speaking with you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.